Italy, 1924. A young politician on his way to work is snatched off the streets, never to be seen again. His name is Giacomo Matteotti, and his assassination will serve as the trigger for the emergence of a brutal dictatorship. In the years prior, this tenacious socialist had fought with all his might to expose a new and rapidly growing political force, the National Fascist Party, or PNF, led by one Benito Mussolini. In the turmoil of post-World War I Italy, this group had quickly ascended to power, and speaking out against them soon became dangerous. Matteotti's assassination at the hands of Mussolini's paramilitary force, the Black Shirts, was a risky move, but one that would ultimately seal Mussolini's rule over Italy for the next 2 decades. Today we look at the assassination of Giacomo Matteotti, a killing that changed the course of European history. In the early 1920s, Italy was a land in crisis. Though the Italians had ended the First World War on the winning side, it quickly became clear that the spoils had not been worth the sacrifice. Scarred by immense losses and broken promises, Italian nationalists furiously referred to the war as the mutilated victory. In this bitter environment, politics were highly unstable, characterised by weak liberal leadership and a prevailing fear of the socialists. Some believed that the socialists had the potential to trigger a revolution like in Russia a few years earlier, and a number of crippling strikes only deepened this fear, as well as the country's state of crisis. Out of this chaos emerged the PNF, led by the charismatic Mussolini, who promised to deliver the strong leadership that was desperately needed. A former socialist who had been booted out over his support for the war, Mussolini's rhetoric of militarism and national renewal began to win over the Italian people. In October 1922, his black shirt forces marched on Rome and seized power, with King Victor Emmanuel III refusing to act against them out of fear of triggering a civil war between the black shirts and the regular army. For elites such as the Crown and the Church, a fascist government was far more appealing than a socialist one. Mussolini was now in power, but not yet a dictator. The socialists became his most troublesome opponents, and few fought against him more fiercely than Giacomo Matteotti. Tenacious, well-read, and uncompromising, Matteotti had been warning against the danger of the fascists for years. His fierce tirades regularly led to him being violently threatened in the fascist newspaper Il Popolo d'Italia. In 1923, the controversial Acerbo Law was drafted. This law proposed that whichever party could achieve more than 25% of the vote in a general election would be given 2/3 of the seat in the lower house of the Italian parliament, the Chamber of Deputies. It was an obvious ploy by the fascists to gain political dominance, but intimidation from the black shirts and dissatisfaction with the current system meant that the Acerbo Law was quickly passed. The 1924 general election unsurprisingly saw the PNF sweep to victory amidst widespread electoral frauds and intimidation. The socialists were down and Italian democracy was on borrowed time, but Matteotti was not done fighting just yet. On May 30th, 1924, he delivered what would become a famous, but ultimately futile speech. On the floor of the chamber, he tore into the fascists more violently than ever before, highlighting the rampant corruption and demanding that the election be voided. Evidence suggests that he had also been plotting to expose a bribery scheme between the fascists and an American oil company to undermine them even further. Matteotti had officially become too dangerous. From the shadows, the black shirts now sharpened their axes and prepared their revenge. On the sunny morning of June 10th, 11 days after his speech, Matteotti was walking to work when suddenly a car pulled up beside him. In broad daylight, he was dragged inside by 5 members of a fascist hit squad and stabbed to death at the age of 39. For the fallen Matteotti, it had been a grisly end. Although the fascists had now brutally silenced their fiercest enemy, they had also overstepped and taken a massive risk. For Mussolini now faced a perilous tightrope in front of him, one that would ultimately determine the next 2 decades of Italian history. Within days of Matteotti's disappearance, the socialists and Italian society at large began to point the finger at the fascists. The hit squad had been very brazen to commit the act in broad daylight, and if they thought it had been a clean assassination, they were about to learn that they were very wrong. A witness had noted the car's license plate, and police soon traced it to a man named Amerigo Dumini. This vicious black-shirt hitman had been the leader of the murder squad, and when his identity was made public, Mussolini was held over the fire. Now, whether or not the fascist leader had directly ordered Matteotti's murder is a question that has been debated for over 100 years. However, there is little doubt that he was the architect of the atmosphere that allowed such violence to take place, a dark and unforgiving reality that Matteotti himself had desperately tried to warn against. Mussolini was in trouble. Even after dismissing powerful figures within his own party and allowing the arrest of the assassins, both membership and public confidence in his party plummeted. His downfall now seemed imminent. At the same time, the political opposition walked out of parliament, including some who had previously supported him. This move became known as the Aventine Secession, a tactic designed to pressure the king into forcing Mussolini's removal. However, it faced one massive problem. Once again, the king simply did not act. In an echo of what had happened during the March on Rome 2 years earlier, he was scared to death of causing a civil war that could threaten his own position. Fear of the socialists also still outweighed that of the fascists, even after Matteotti's murder. Meanwhile, cracks in the unity of the opposition quickly began to emerge. With their strategy now dead in the water, their absence from the chamber meant that cohesive resistance against Mussolini was effectively impossible. Even the murder investigation itself was quickly poisoned by fascist meddling. Witness intimidation, the suspicious loss of crucial documents, and the existence of sympathetic individuals in the police all served to throw the investigation down a hall of smoke and mirrors. Preparation for the trial slowed to a crawl, and Mussolini was able to sit back and watch as the furor against him gradually simmered down. By the end of 1924, the crisis that had threatened to topple the Italian leader had faded into little more than an inconvenience. As the urgency of Giacomo Matteotti's warnings were gradually carried away by the winds of history, Benito Mussolini suddenly found himself in a new position of strength. His power once on a knife edge, the fascist leader was now ready to go on the offensive. Before long, both his dictatorship and Italy's future would be sealed. On January 3rd, 1925, Mussolini took one of the boldest moves of his political career. Addressing the Chamber of Deputies, he claimed that he took full political, moral, and historical responsibility for all that had happened, an indirect and taunting reference to the murder itself. Daring his opponents to arrest him, he knew that no one sat in front of him would risk it. Shielded by the king's inaction and the ruthlessness of the black shirts, Mussolini knew that he was now untouchable. From this very moment, the path to dictatorship was sealed. Newspapers were suppressed, all other political groups were banned, and opposition became a deadly endeavour. The PNF now ruled Italy unopposed, and Mussolini took a new title, Il Duce. Meanwhile, Dumini and the other assassins were eventually put on trial in 1926, long after the killing had started to fade from public memory. With the law now under Mussolini's thumb, it had already been decided prior to this that the killing was not premeditated, a move that absolved senior fascists of any responsibility. At the trial, Dumini and his fellow conspirators received laughably short sentences. Combined with an amnesty granted by the government, many of them were released within months. True justice, it seemed, had died as well. With his position at home secured, Mussolini now looked towards the European continent for his next move. He first undermined Europe's peacekeeping body, the League of Nations, and in 1939 formed the Pact of Steel with another European dictator, Germany's Adolf Hitler. Mussolini had largely inspired Hitler, and their pact became the foundation for the Axis powers in World War II. But ironically for the war-hungry Duce, this conflict would set the stage for his downfall. Drained from previous military ventures and suffering from weak industrial output, by 1943, Italy was in serious trouble. The Allied invasion of Sicily that year led to Mussolini's overthrow by the fascist Grand Council, and the king quickly had him arrested. Soon after, Italy collapsed into the civil war that the king had long feared. Although the Germans reinstalled Mussolini as a puppet leader in northern Italy, by April 1945 the war was lost. That month, Mussolini was captured and killed by communist partisans before his body was strung upside down in Milan and beaten by a jeering crowd. At last, both Mussolini and fascist Italy were finally dead. But this isn't quite the end of the story. With their immunity gone, Dumini and his fellow assassins were once again put on trial after the war. Long suppressed documents were finally unearthed, and in 1947, Dumini and two of his accomplices were sentenced to 30 years in prison. Another amnesty, however, saw them released in the mid-1950s. The assassination of Giacomo Matteotti was one of the most dramatic turning points in 20th century European history. In a bitter and divided nation, one man had committed a blatant act of state terror in the face of an opposition too weak to fight back, and a king too scared to act. As a result, what could have served as the hammer to break fascist Italy instead proved to be the foundation stone upon which it was built. Although very different in both circumstance and outcome, a decade later, echoes of this killing would return in both the Night of the Long Knives in Nazi Germany and the assassination of Sergei Kirov in the Soviet Union. Like the Matteotti killing, these incidents eventually led to the same result: a dictator achieving a totalitarian state through the death of a rival. But perhaps above all, the Matteotti murder highlights the fearlessness of a man who recognised the danger of the fascists and was prepared to bring them down at any cost. Today, Giacomo Matteotti is remembered as a martyr and symbol of resistance against one of the darkest periods in Italian history. As for Benito Mussolini, the man the world believes to be behind it, whether or not he actually ordered this assassination remains one of Italy's darkest and most endlessly debated mysteries. As always, we hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more from the Assassinations archive.